We are awakening together. This is our weekly gathering we hold online. For more information, visit our website, awakening-together.org. We'd love to see you there.
All right. Hello, everyone, and happy Sunday. So the name of the gathering today is Does a Person Have Freedom of Choice? And it's kind of interesting because just a couple weeks ago, Beverly had a very similar topic. So I thought it was interesting that I should be guided on that same topic, but apparently we need more of it. And of course, it'll be approached differently today. But, getting the same topic twice in 1 month, I would say we should listen up. But before we begin, why don't we do what we like to do, which is greet one another while Dawn plays our opening song, Awakening by Deborah Premal and Mitten. That's a great video, isn't it? Gives me chills. All right, so let's go into our prayer. So today, I am here for one purpose only, and that is to help us remember who we are, what we are. And also, in order to do that, we have to see what we aren't, what is not true about us. We confuse the costume with the life awareness that we are. We act from the costume, we act from the mask. We suffer, and it's so completely unnecessary. So today, let's remember and be free. Amen. All right, and with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Audrey. She is our reader today. She is going to read some excerpts from Rupert Spira's Transparency of Things. So Audrey, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Regina. And as Regina just said, these are excerpts from the Transparency of Things by Rupert Spira. Does the individual have free will? Even conventional science tells us that there are no separate entities in the universe, that everything is interconnected. So the issue of whether or not an apparent separate entity has free will or choice is really not addressed here. Rather, we go straight to the question about the existence of the separate entity, and, having explored it thoroughly, we see what happens to the question about free will and choice. Nothing binds consciousness except its own desire to bind itself through belief. Every experience arises spontaneously out of the absolute freedom of consciousness at every moment. And in that sense, consciousness is free to take any form it chooses out of an infinity of possibilities. Every apparent choice is an expression of the absolute freedom of consciousness. The sense of freedom and choice that we feel is an intuition of the innate freedom of consciousness, which, at some level, we know to be our own. There is something oppressive about teachings that continuously reiterate the fact that we have no choice or freedom. Such a statement is directed at a non-existent personal entity, and ironically, in doing so, condones the very entity it denies. It is true that the separate entity has no freedom, but as there is no separate entity, why mention it? Consciousness, that which we are, is freedom itself. We, as consciousness, have absolute freedom. We are absolute freedom. The feeling that we have the freedom to make a choice is a pale and usually misinterpreted reflection of this intuitive knowledge of our own innate freedom. As a reflection of real freedom, it is true. Only the interpretation that this freedom is the freedom of an individual entity is false. Imagine a king who has enjoyed life in his palace. One day he wishes to experience the life of one of his subjects, and so he instructs his ministers to treat him as a normal person until he commands them otherwise. On the next day, the king goes out into the marketplace disguised as a peasant, and although his ministers are watching from a distance, they are powerless to intervene. To begin with, the king does not notice that the enjoyment he feels in the marketplace is of the same nature as the enjoyment he feels in the palace, so he soon forgets that he is pretending. Presently, he begins to suffer, and having forgotten his birthright, tries all sorts of strategies within the marketplace in order to alleviate it. However, nothing that is on offer can remind him or return him to his palace. Seeing his plight and feeling powerless to help, the ministers dress up as ordinary men. From time to time, the king encounters one of his disguised ministers and, without betraying their promise to treat him as a normal person, they indicate to him that he is not what he thinks and feels himself to be. Due to the depth of his amnesia, the king takes some time, but sooner or later he remembers who he really is and returns to the palace, ordering the ministers to resume their official duties. At the very moment the king abdicated his royal powers, he gave up his freedom of his own free will. His freedom expressed itself as the desire not to be free. From that moment on, he seemed to be bound, and the circumstances of his life seemed to confirm his new status. In this state, the only freedom available to the king pretending to be an ordinary person is the freedom to remember himself again, as he truly is. It is only when the king reclaims his royal identity that he realizes that although he thought, felt, and behaved as though he were bound, in fact, he was always free. He realizes that his status as an ordinary person was self-imposed and imaginary, and that even when he was deeply involved with the traumas of being an ordinary person, he was, nevertheless, always the king. There was nothing that could be done, or more importantly, that needed to be done to reclaim his birthright, other than simply to recognize it and to start behaving accordingly. As the peasant, the king had no freedom other than to remember his true identity. As the king, he always had complete freedom. Once consciousness has chosen, out of its own inherent freedom, to identify itself with a fragment, the only freedom available to it is to disidentify itself from that fragment, to know itself again as it always is. It is for this reason that the statements, "you have no freedom," and "you have complete freedom," are both true from different points of view. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for saying yes to being my reader. I can tell you one of the great challenges of being the minister is finding a reader. So you saved me this month. Thank you. All right, there are a few things that Audrey read, which I just want to reiterate before I jump into what I'm going to jump into. Again, the question is, does the person have freedom of choice? And Rupert Spira says, even conventional science tells us that there are no separate entities in the universe. In other words, the question itself is flawed. And this is what's really important for us to see. You see, when we ask, when we say, does the person have freedom of choice? Or when we say, do I have freedom of choice? And I means the person. We're mistaken right from the get-go about what we are. And that's the problem with the question. Kind of reminds me of in Peaceful Warrior when Socrates told Dan Millman, you need to learn to ask better questions. What kind of an answer can you get if the question is flawed? So the question really isn't, does the person have freedom of choice? The question really is, what am I? Right? I mean, if you look at the masters like Ramana Maharshi, when they're teaching you to ask the question that's going to lead you to truth, they do not say, ask, do I have freedom of choice? Right? They say, ask, what am I? So again, Rupert Spira says, even conventional science tells us there are no separate entities in the universe. And then he goes on to say at the end of that same sentence that everything is interconnected. One of the images that came to me a long time ago was like this huge machine, which was nothing but cogs, cogs, these little round circles with all these little notches all the way around. And one cog intersects with the next cog. And as this cog turns, this cog also turns because of the intersection. So this great big giant machine of cogs. And when any cog turns on the machine, all the cogs turn because of their interconnection. And they have no choice about that. There isn't a cog in the machine that can say, I'm not going to turn while all the others turn. You see, what happens is we confuse ourselves with a cog. And then we ask, do I have freedom of choice? Well, the answer there, if we were the cog, the answer would be no. When the cogs are turning, the cogs are turning. And there's nothing you can do about that. You can't stop. But the problem is you're not a cog. You see, you're not a cog. So again, the question is flawed. It's as he said, let's see, where did he say that? It is true that the separate entity has no freedom. But as there is no separate entity, why mention it? The Course calls it level confusion, right? When we're asking, do I have freedom of choice? And our I means this person. We're at level confusion. We're confused about what we are in the first place. The question itself is completely flawed. You see, what's actually going on here, this machine of cogs represents the universe or the world. And those cogs are turning. And the universe is happening. But you're the one watching the machine. You say you aren't a part of the machine. And that's what we are here to remember. Not even remember. Notice. Because you can actually just notice over and over again that you are the watcher. Now, it may be true that within your experience, you're zoomed in more on one cog than any of the other cogs. So you're the watcher of that cog, right? More, you can see the other cogs too, but more. You're zoomed in more on one cog. But what you want to do is notice that you're the watcher of that cog, that you are not the cog. You know, and this is a practice that often happens. This is a very common type of meditation. It's not the meditation that I emphasize, because I emphasize the awareness, watching awareness meditation, but another very common type of meditation is watching the thoughts. Watching the thoughts come in and watching the thoughts go out. And one of the things that you do in this common type of meditation is notice that you are not deciding what thoughts are going to appear. They just appear, right? They just appear. We could say there's no freedom of choice about what thoughts are going to appear. And one of the mistakes I think that a lot of spiritual students make at some point along the way is feeling guilty for the thoughts that show up in their mind. You know, maybe some strong judgment thought shows up in your mind, or maybe even a thought, I just want to kill him, right? Maybe that shows up in the mind. But again, feeling guilty about those thoughts showing up is level confusion. You aren't responsible for those thoughts showing up. They're just showing up because the cogs are moving on the machine. You're the watcher. That's all you are, is the watcher. That's all you are, is the watcher. That's all you are, is the watcher. And interestingly, if you are able to maintain that awareness, a thought can show up, I just want to kill him. And it has no power, it has no meaning, it has nothing to do with you. One of the things that was interesting in the video that we watched, you know, there were several people holding up these signs about what they believed about themselves. I wrote down a few of them. One said addict, one said victim, one said weak, one said rejected, there was betrayed, you know. But one of them said, I am angry. I am angry. That's level confusion, right? What's happening is the cogs are moving, an anger thought is coming in, but you are just the watcher. And you cannot experience yourself as I am angry, or I am rejected, or I am betrayed, or I am annoyed, or I am scared, or anything else, if you realize you are just the watcher. So again, what Rupert Spira is emphasizing is that the question, do I, when I means the person, do I have freedom of choice? The question is flawed. There isn't a good answer to that question because the question is wrong in the first place, because you are not the person. In fact, he goes so far as to say there is no person. And at the same time, he says nothing binds consciousness except its own desire to bind itself through belief. Right? He tells this story about the king, and he says that the king's freedom was expressed as the desire not to be free. I'm going to pull out NTI Acts chapter 10. You know, and I remember, not clearly with the mind, but clearly with the heart, the day this was written, because it was so amazing to me, because these thoughts had never entered my mind before. This realization had never entered my mind before. And it was so clear as it came in Acts chapter 10. If any of you guys happen to have NTI at hand, you can open it up to page 234. And about a quarter to a third of the way down the page, you'll see sentence 17 that begins with "in the beginning." And that's where I'm going to begin, in the beginning. So, in the beginning, which has no beginning at all, there was God. Or Rupert Spira would say there was consciousness. And God is all there is today. But the existence of God sought a freedom that was different than the freedom it had known. Of course, what freedom could be different from freedom? When freedom is free, as your freedom is, nothing can be different except the illusion of not being free. You see, that's exactly what Rupert Spira says here. Rupert Spira, using the king story, says that the king, who had the most freedom, of course, in the kingdom, had this desire to experience himself as one of the subjects who did not have his freedom. Right? A subject to his laws, right? Did not have his freedom. And so his freedom was expressed as the desire not to be free. And of course, as he went forward with this experiment, he actually forgot he was the king. And he began to suffer from his apparent lack of freedom, which never actually existed because he always was the king. You see, when we identify with the person, that's what we're doing. When we identify with the person, instead of noticing that we are just the watcher, merely the watcher, we are forgetting who we are. The watcher is the king. We're forgetting who we are. We're becoming identified with the thoughts and the feelings and everything that's going on with this body-mind. And we begin to suffer. When in any moment, this is what's so cool. At any moment, you can simply step back into the watcher and the suffering ends. The only reason that you suffer is because you're believing that you're the subject instead of the king, the person instead of the watcher. And you have the freedom to do that, right? Your freedom is being expressed in that forgetfulness. But no, the person's not free. The person is a part of this script that is being developed. And if you identify with the person, you will experience a lack of freedom. But you don't ever have to. And there's nothing else you have to learn. At any moment, you just step back and watch. At any moment, you just step back and watch. Even if you just believe something, even if there was an insult that came in, another cog insulted you, insulted your cog. And you believed it and you feel that hurt. At that point, you just step back. You watch the thoughts that are going on as a result of the insult. You watch the feelings that are going on as a result of the insult. You watch the show. You realize it's a show. Everybody here knows how to watch a movie. That's all you do. You just step back into watching the movie. Everybody here knows movies aren't, quote, all good. We probably wouldn't watch them if they were. They have drama, right? They have scary moments. You just step back and watch the movie. You don't ask the movie to be all good. You just step back and watch the movie. Now, interestingly, your experience of the movie does begin to change as you begin to remember who you are. right? When you remember yourself as the watcher, when you remember yourself as that freedom, interestingly, the movie also begins to change. It becomes a lighter movie because the only reason it was as involved as it was is because your belief was involved. So when your belief is not as involved, the movie is a lighter movie. But things still keep on happening. I mean, I'm still sitting here in smoky Colorado where I haven't seen the sky in 3 or 4 days. But the joy of who you are is with you in all experiences when you remember who you are. NTI, continuing, starting with sentence 22, says, opposites were made from a state of freedom, so freedom may be expressed because it is free. And then it says, this is the expression of you. So what NTI is really saying is that the apparent person is an expression of freedom. And everything the apparent person goes through is an expression of freedom. And it's the expression of the freedom to experience not free. That answers the question right there. Does the person have freedom of choice? It can't, because the person is the expression of the experience of not free. That's what the person is. Think about that. Consciousness, which is far beyond the person, out of a desire to experience something other than freedom, and the only thing other than freedom is its opposite, not free, created the person to have that experience of not free. So, oh my God, no, of course the person's not free. Of course the person's not free. You know, Rupert Spira says the same thing, right? He says the separate entity has no freedom. But the point is, you aren't the separate entity. You aren't the person. You aren't the individual. So you are free. And the freedom that you have when you're identified with an individual, the freedom that you have is the freedom to remember yourself. Not the freedom to control which thoughts come into the mind. You can't do that. These cogs are already in motion. They're already moving. You know, in the teachings of Inner Ramana, there's a message in here that says, the only choice is where. This says, the truth is that all thought rises out of the sense of I, or because of the sense of I as a correction, which means even right-minded thoughts are part of the movement of the cogs, right? There's thoughts that come in due to the belief in separate entity, and then there's thoughts that come in as a correction to that. But then it says the state of true being precedes thought. It's prior to both what we would call the wrong mind and the right mind. It's prior to both. You are not the right mind even. You are the watcher. Right? You are the watcher. The state of true being precedes thought. Therefore, it is before thought, beyond thought, and after thought. You know, it's before, during, and after, which what's really cool about that, again, is if there's forgetting and there's believing and there's insulting and there's hurt, well, after that, you can still choose watcher. It's not like you have to choose it in advance. If you can, that's great. You won't experience hurt when the insult comes. But if you can't, you can remember after. And right back in freedom. You always have the choice to go right back into freedom, because who you are is before the thought, during the thought, and after the thought. It's always there, so you always have the freedom to choose your truth. You always have the freedom to notice you're the watcher. And the moment you do, you experience the freedom of being the watcher. As long as you're choosing an experience that's different freedom, which is the same as choosing an identification with a self that's not your true self, then you experience being bound, although you're never really, truly bound. Sentence 26 says, since freedom is all that was given you, freedom is all that you are. But that expression has been used, the expression again is the person, that expression has been used to make something different from that which is. And so the expression of freedom made lack of freedom. And that is also the expression that you are. In other words, you experience yourself there. You experience yourself in the lack of freedom. You seem to be the lack of freedom when freedom is what you are. You seem to be the lack of freedom when freedom is what you are. So the lack that you experience is an expression of the freedom that you are. But all of this you have forgotten. For you chose to forget it when you chose an experience different than the experience you know. In other words, consciousness couldn't actually experience lack of freedom, being the subject, if it remembered it was consciousness. It wouldn't be the actual experience of lack of freedom if you remembered you were free. So even our forgetfulness is a part of our creativity, is a part of our freedom. We wanted to genuinely experience something different than the freedom that we are. And the only way we could genuinely experience something different was to forget what we are. However, at any point, we can change our mind and, quote, remember. Which, as I said, it's not really remembering, it's a noticing. You can notice because it's true right now. You can notice that you see those thoughts. You can notice that you see those emotions. You can notice that you see the body reacting. You can notice that you see, you always see. You can notice that, as the person seems to go through multiple experiences, some that we would define as good, some that we would define as bad, as the thoughts are really generous on one day and the thoughts are really selfish on another day, as the thoughts have a lot of self-confidence on one day, as the thoughts seem to have a lot of unworthiness on another day, as the feelings are more positive on one day and are in one moment and then more negative in another day and another moment, the one thing that never changes is you're watching. You're noticing. You're seeing. You see every bit of it, and that never changes. That never changes because that's what you really are. The person is a show. The person is an expression of a wish for the purpose of an experience. But it's not what you are. And you always have the choice to remember. And like I said, it's not even really remember. I mean, that's an important point because I think I spent years thinking I had to remember something I'd forgotten. That's a frustrating place to be. How am I going to remember something that I consciously chose to forget, You don't remember. Remember is just a word. that people use. You notice. Notice it over and over again, no matter what's going on. Notice you're watching. Notice. Notice. Right? That's what you do. You notice. And you keep noticing until you're certain that you're the watcher, and you're not really acting from the watcher, because the watcher doesn't act. But what will begin to happen is the person, you'll see the person reflecting that awareness. The person is an expression of what you believe you are, and you aren't the person, right? The person is an expression of what you believe you are. So when you believe you're the person, then the person acts from that belief, and it gets all involved, and it gets angry, and it tries to control, and it wants things a certain way, right? It's acting from that expression. But when you start to be aware that you're the watcher, genuinely aware that you're the watcher and you're in the state of watching, the person also begins to settle down. It's a reflection. It's like the movie that we're watching and talking about today. It's your avatar, right? It's your avatar. So it's expressing based on what you are identifying with. Your truth, or this experience of not free. That's where your freedom lies. This is what Buddha tried to tell people oh so long ago, but he was not hardly at all understood. When he tried to talk about how everything is interconnected, his focus wasn't on the everything is interconnected, even though he talked about that. His focus was on your only freedom is to remember what you are. That was Buddha's focus. That was the message he tried to share. NTI says, the Holy Spirit is the memory of the experience you know, which means perfect freedom, consciousness, which is the truth of your freedom and the truth of you now, perfect freedom and consciousness. In your true desire to be only free, this truth has been accepted. So the purpose of freedom, which is the purpose of the Holy Spirit, is the purpose of now. What all of this means is there is a right mind also. Just like there's a wrong mind, there's a right mind. You are not the right mind, don't get me wrong. But the right mind is pointing you back to what you are. So if you can't step all the way back into just being the watcher, which is supreme, then step into a person who listens to the right mind instead of the wrong mind. That's actually just a bridge identity. It's not the truth of what you are, but it's moving in the right direction because it's pointing in the right direction. So you could say you have three choices in life. Three. One is to identify with the person and therefore be stuck in the script, right? Believing every thought that comes in the mind, reacting the way it tells you to react, feeling what it tells you to feel, the experience of total slavery. Two, to identify with the right mind and disregard the wrong mind, and to live from that right mind. Now, interestingly, in order to do that, you have to step somewhat into watching. That's why it moves in the right direction. You have to be watching somewhat in order to discern between wrong mind and right mind. So you're moving towards yourself as the watcher when you choose to live only from the right mind. You can't live only from the right mind without watching. But there's still a mistake here because there's still some identification with the person, with the mind. So it's a bridge. The Holy Spirit is a bridge. The Course tells us that clearly. But it's moving in the right direction. Or 3, you step all the way out and you're merely the watcher. That's your perfect freedom. Those are your choices. And those choices don't belong to the person. They belong to you, consciousness. So the question was, does a person have freedom of choice? The answer is no. But you're not the person. So who cares? Remember who you are. Notice who you are. Or if that feels like too big of a step, start practicing discernment and be the person that lives from the right mind. Make those choices. Those apparent choices. Consciousness is making the choice, not the person. You'll experience it as the person making the choices. That's okay, because it's a bridge moving in the right direction. There is absolutely no choice in the wrong mind. You're just going to be flung about, tossed around by that script. So there you have it. Wrong mind equals slavery. Right mind equals apparent choice, moving towards who you really are. Choosing to step back into the watcher is abiding as yourself. And those are the only choices that are truly available. All other choices, all other apparent choices are just a part of the script. So with that said, I'm going to ask Dawn to play our contemplation song. Of course, if you choose to donate, Dawn will also give a link so that you can donate. The contemplation song, again, one of my favorites. It's by Omkara. It's simply called Remember. All right, thank you very much. So this is our time in the weekly gathering where you all get to share if you want to. And again, Dawn, since I'm spotlighted, I can't see the hands, so if you'll help me with that. Or you guys could just unmic yourself and talk. You have permission to do that too.
Good morning, beloveds. Thank you so much, Regina, for those very important reminders to fall back and remember who we are. A couple of things came up for me while I was contemplating there. The first is the fact that, as consciousness, we chose to have an experience of not free, right? It's almost like we purchased a ticket to Disney World and we get there and we say, no, we want to go to the skating rink. We want to do the skating rink. In other words, for me, it makes it more evident to me why it's so hard to, at times, it feels like all of this intense desire and effort and all of these things are needed because we're literally pushing against, everything to say, hey, we want to go to the skating rink. The other thing that I thought about was, I've been watching this show lately on A&E called 60 Days In. And the show is about people who choose to go into a jail setting for 60 days. They have various motivations for doing so. And then they're also working with the sheriffs in whatever jail they're in to better, I guess, to work, to better their lives there or to make, stop things from happening, whatever the case may be. But this show is fascinating to me because I've seen people go in who were like Marines. There was even the one that sticks out the most to me is there was a police officer. This man, he was a police officer. He was going into this situation, and it's amazing how they forgot their role and they got in these situations in this, you can imagine, the lack of freedom that one would experience in an incarceration. So their freedom is gone all of a sudden, and they know they're getting out in 60 days. They know this. They know that it's not the end of the world. They know they're leaving that situation within 60 days. Yet they turn into, I mean, the changes, the physical changes, their voices. The officer that I'm talking about, his entire demeanor changed in about 20 days because he was acquiescing to his environment, and he had completely forgotten who he was, that he was a police officer and that he was going to be released from that situation in 60 days. So there's two levels there that I totally enjoy about watching that show. The first is watching that forgetting process and seeing how that acquiescing happens and how real it is and it's the same thing for me. And the other level is me as the watcher, right? I'm watching the show. I'm watching that officer forget all about who he is. So it reminds me to fall back into this position that Regina is talking about today, the noticing that I'm the watcher. The entire time that I'm watching the officer completely forget who he is, I'm always remembering that I'm not involved. I'm not incarcerated. I'm the watcher. So that's the other thing that I really thought about as, as this talk, as you shared today, Regina. It's so important for us to consistently fall back and remember that we're the watcher, that we're not, identified so heavily with this cog, as you called it today, that we're not focusing so much on the cog turning, because as you mentioned, the cog will turn. All the cogs will turn when it's time for them to turn. Nothing we can do about that. So I'm going to let go. That's enough for me. And thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Gloria. And that movie, that TV show you're watching was a perfect example. Why don't you type the name in the chat in case anybody else wants to pick up watching that, and let them know what channel it's on. And Dawn, why don't we move into our closing song by Stephen Walters? It's just, again, a reminder that we are always home. We are always the true self. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And Dawn, I'm turning the mic over to you.
Thank you for watching. This was our weekly gathering that we hold online. For more information, you can visit our website at awakening-together.org, or you can subscribe to our Awakening Together channel and click the bell for more notifications when we post our weekly gatherings. Thank you again for watching.